Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk about the latest economic data coming out from Russia, because what we're seeing is something that the Kremlin and the Central Bank of Russia really didn't want to see. After months of claiming inflation was finally coming under control, inflation in Russia is now rising again. And this couldn't have come at a worse possible time, because Russia's economy is already slowing, businesses are struggling with some of the highest borrowing costs in the world. The government is running record budget deficits, certainly in the first 6 months of 2026. Banks have been warning against financial risks, and now inflation is moving in the wrong direction. So we'll go through all of the latest details, and if you're interested in graphs, then this is the video for you, because I'm going to show you some really exciting graphs and we'll go through them in detail. We'll have a look at what's been happening over the last 12 months with inflation. We'll look at food inflation and what ordinary Russians actually think is happening with prices, which is very different to the official data. It's actually a very revealing statistic. And it suggests life inside Russia is considerably more expensive than the official figures would have you believe. Now, before we get into the details on all of that, could I ask you to give me a thumbs up for this video and possibly hit that hype button, which does help to promote this video and really helps me to get more views, so that would be fantastic. And of course, if you haven't subscribed, please hit that big red subscriber button. It's not really a subscription, doesn't cost you anything. It just tells YouTube that you quite like my videos. Now let's get into the details. The latest inflation figures have just been released by Russia's Federal Statistics Reserve. And on the face of it, they might not look immediately alarming. Annual inflation increased from 5.3% in May to 6% in June. Now that might not sound like a dramatic increase, but in reality it represents a very important change in direction, because for much of the last 12 months inflation has been moving lower, and that's exactly what the central bank has been desperately hoping for. If we have a look at this chart, you can see that inflation has been steadily falling over the past 12 months. 12 months ago inflation was sitting at 9.4%. By the fall, it had fallen to 7%. By December, it was down to 5.6%. During the first half of this year, it looked as though inflation had stabilised between 5 and 6%. And as I just mentioned, in May, it came down to 5.3%. That was the lowest reading for over 12 months. Everything appeared to be heading in the right direction. However, the June figures have now been released, and instead of continuing lower, inflation has jumped back up to 6%. Now that might only be 0.7%, but percentage increases matter. Inflation has increased by around 13% compared with the previous month when you look at the month-on-month change. More importantly, it has moved even further away from the central bank's target rate, because the Bank of Russia's official target inflation level is 4%. Today's figure is 50% above where policymakers want inflation to be. And that's a major problem for Russia, because inflation isn't simply an inconvenience. It determines what the central bank can do with interest rates. And right now, interest rates are arguably the single biggest issue facing the Russian economy. As most of you will know, the standard response to high inflation from a central bank is to increase interest rates. Higher interest rates discourage borrowing, they reduce spending and reduce investment, and ultimately they slow demand across the economy. That normally brings inflation down. But the problem is that it also slows economic growth. Russia has been living with extraordinarily high interest rates for a prolonged period because inflation has remained stubbornly high ever since the invasion of Ukraine started back in 2022. If we take a step back and look over the last several years, you can see how persistent this problem has become. At the beginning of 2024, inflation was running at around 7.4%. Instead of improving, it accelerated throughout 2024, eventually reaching a peak of 10.3% in March 25. That's well into double-digit territory. Since then, the central bank has gradually managed to bring inflation lower, but it's never come anywhere near the objective of 4%. Even today's figure of 6% is significantly above that target. So although inflation has improved from the peak levels, Russia has by no means solved its inflation problem. And today's increase raises the possibility that progress may have stalled altogether. Now let's move on to look at food inflation, because this tells an equally interesting story. Now, food inflation often has a much bigger impact on ordinary households than headline inflation. People notice food prices. They buy food every day or every week, and when supermarket bills keep rising, consumers immediately feel poorer. And as we've talked about in previous videos, the poorest members of society spend a higher percentage of their income on food, so it's disproportionately impacting them. And again, here we can see a very similar pattern. Food inflation was running at about 11% in the middle of last year. It gradually declined month on month, and by May it had fallen to around 2.9%, which looked like genuine progress. But June has reversed that trend. Food inflation has climbed back up to 3.4%, which again is not a dramatic increase at face value, but it's enough to suggest that inflationary measures have started building in the Russian economy. And remember, food prices matter politically. Governments can often explain away rising prices for luxury goods, but it's much harder to explain prices of bread and milk and meat and fruit and vegetables and everyday items that households are buying that are essential to them. When food inflation starts rising again, consumers notice very quickly. And that brings us to perhaps the most fascinating chart of all, because this one measures something entirely different. This isn't actual inflation. These are inflation expectations. In other words, the Bank of Russia regularly asks ordinary Russians what they believe inflation is running at. And the latest result is astonishing. Official inflation was reported at 6% in June, but Russian consumers believe inflation is running at 12.4%, more than double the official figure. And if you just think about what that means, whether or not the official statistics are accurate, ordinary Russians clearly feel that prices are rising much faster than the government says they are. Their experience of everyday life is dramatically different from the published data. And that's hugely significant because economics isn't driven solely by official statistics. It's driven by behavior. If consumers believe prices are going to keep rising, they bring forward purchases. If businesses believe their costs will increase, they raise prices today. If workers believe inflation will remain high, they demand higher wages. Economists refer to this as inflation expectations becoming embedded. Once that happens, inflation becomes much harder to eliminate. This is one of the reasons central banks monitor expectations so closely, because if people lose confidence that inflation will fall, it often becomes a self-fulfilling cycle. And that's exactly what today's figures risk showing. Now let's think about what all of this means for Russia going forward. The Bank of Russia desperately wants to reduce interest rates. Lower rates would help businesses borrow, they would support investment, they'd reduce financing costs and stimulate the Russian economy. And they would also reduce some of the enormous pressure currently being placed on companies across Russia that have debt. But if inflation starts rising again, that becomes much more difficult to achieve. Central banks simply can't continue cutting interest rates aggressively if inflation is moving in the opposite direction. They may have to slow the pace of reductions or maybe pause altogether, and in an extreme scenario consider actually increasing rates. None of those outcomes are good for the Russian economy because Russia is already facing slowing economic growth, a rapidly expanding budget deficit, labour shortages, falling energy revenues, and increasing financial stress across many sectors. Adding persistently high inflation to that list only makes the challenge even greater. So although today's inflation report may not grab headlines around the world, it could prove to be one of the more important economic releases of this month because it suggests that Russia's battle against inflation is far from over. The progress seen over the last year may already be starting to reverse, and perhaps the most worrying statistic of all isn't the official inflation rate, it's the fact that ordinary Russians believe inflation is more than twice as high. If that perception continues, the central bank's job becomes significantly harder, interest rates are likely to remain elevated, economic growth will remain under pressure, and the outlook for Russia's economy becomes even more challenging in the second half of 2026. So hopefully you found today's video useful, informative, most importantly thought-provoking. If you have liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel and hit that hype button if you can, if it's available to you. That would really help me out. Thank you so much to everyone that supported me. If you bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks or signed up as a patron or a member, thank you for that support. Really does help to keep me motivated and making these sort of videos. So I really do appreciate it.